Before I was a think tanker, I was a union representative. I worked for a union that is both aligned with and sometimes a competitor with Sean's union in Canada. And the last day of my job as a union representative, I filed 3 successful applications for certification, one for a retirement home, one for garbage truck workers, and one for pipe fitters. It was a good way to go out. Those people all have better wages and better protection now. So that's my background. I actually come from the world of labor in Canada. My grandmother was a union member despite never having worked for pay a day in her life. She was a member of a union in Canada called the CLAC, Christian Labor Association. She was a member of something called a General Workers Local, workers who contributed and paid dues despite never having a union contract. So that's my sort of family background, that's my professional background, and I'm here to talk about the Roman Catholic, or at least the Christian understandings of the roots of labor, organized labor. Those roots are found in a number of key principles that I'm going to outline for you. The first of those roots is that the worker, in the words of John Paul II, is a human agent capable of deciding for him or herself about the work that he or she is doing. That the work is inherently linked with the dignity of the worker as a human being, and that anything that undermines the dignity of that worker, including treating that worker as somebody that does not have any say in the workplace, undermines the dignity of that person as a human being, and therefore is contrary to the way that we should work together as human beings. The second thing is that work is necessarily a communal endeavor. The workplace is not, and we're going to pick on the Cato Institute, so let's just go with that. The workplace is not, as the Cato Institute and many actually other economists on both the left and the right would say, a collection of contracting, atomized individuals, but a community with its own subjectivity and its own telos of creating socially useful goods and services which lead to human thriving and development. It is a community, the workplace. Next, that within that community there are different responsibilities, authorities, and tasks, and that while labor and capital have a shared interest in the communal goal of the enterprise, these interests do not always align, and that this is particularly true for compensation and working conditions, things like scheduling and so on. As the Prime Minister in the Netherlands said in 1891 in the heart of the Industrial Revolution, capital will take care of itself. Who will speak for the workers? That was the head of a party called the Anti-Revolutionary Party, which was a coalition of Protestant, Dutch Protestant, and Dutch Catholic. It was the first political party and later became a political juggernaut. He said, capital will take care of itself, who will take care of the workers? The next point is that because those interests don't always align, that workers can and should form their own communities which protect their interests and negotiate those interests in partnership with the interest of capital to best achieve their mutually shared interests in the success of the enterprise. The next point is that there is not necessarily a conflict. The difference in interest does not necessarily mean an opposition or an adversarial conflict between labor and capital, but that nonetheless, because of the nature of human beings and original sin, differences and conflicts will arise. And that the best way to deal with these conflicts and these differences is within the workplace community based on mutually determined rules and procedures, something like a collective agreement. The next point is to note that all of this precedes the state. That is, that the primary locus of agency emerges out of worker solidarity and shared views of the telos of the enterprise. Workers organize, state law ratifies. The premise of subsidiarity in Catholic social thought teaches that decisions are to be best made at the level of those, or at the place where those who are affected by those decisions, they should be made though. Those with authority should do that there. The next point is that the state does have a positive role to play in enabling these organizations to form and thrive. It's not simply a matter of saying state hands off. You hear people like your friend Ted Cruz saying that small government is best. That's not always the case. Just government is best. And just government is a government that understands that various organizations and communities within a broader community of a nation should be addressed in policy in ways that enable them to thrive and to form. And the state has an obligation to prefer this type of action, this enabling action of communities themselves to direct their own affairs, rather than direct intervention in local matters. Though, of course, it does have to act as an adjudicator when things break down, as they sometimes do, right, Sean? Every now and then. Sometimes that means actually creating the right to strike. Sometimes that means adjudicating in that and elsewhere. I would say that vice versa, that union interaction with the state should be limited to matters which lead to labor's thriving and should avoid giving its authority to the state either by asking for things like state laws on scheduling or state laws on wages, but it should also avoid dealing with things that are not directly related to the workers' interest or emerge out of the workers' voices. And I would say it would be a failure if this conference were so successful that union loyalty switched from being almost automatically linked with the Democratic Party to automatically linked with the Republican Party. Labor unions should be independent, as our friends in Cuba have tried. And lastly, the last principle is that all of this emerges within a contingent history as a complex mixture of the practical realities of actual workers in actual workplaces, while at the same time, those practices are informed by deeper commitments about who the worker is and what a human being is. The history of labor in the United States sees the emergence of labor in just this setting. Labor unions emerged as pre-legal, pre-political worker associations that were only later ratified by law, sometimes after real struggle and sometimes after actual violence. In the midst of that, there were a variety of worldviews at play that tried to shape that view of labor. There was Marxism among them. But the most articulate, productive, and long-lasting came from religious motivations, including Jews, Protestants, and significantly Roman Catholics who drew on the new things outlined in Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum. However, due to the historical timing of this, the Wagner Act, I think, was passed in the 1935. I always say that America and Canada, which basically rubber-stamped and replicated the Wagner Act, was passed in 1944. So you've got the Great Depression and World War II. I often think that North American labor policy was forged in hell. It was forged within a geopolitical environment with a rising revolutionary Marxist power in the USSR, and so the US legal environment assumed an adversarial relationship between labor and capital and tried to keep it within its bounds. Moreover, the American Union movement and its relationship with the state and political parties developed to such an extent that today, with very few exceptions, there is virtually no daylight between the Democratic Party and organized labor. Just look at the amount of money given to the various candidates. I've done it. You can review an article that I wrote in National Affairs. It's not even close. It's almost entirely given to the Democratic Party. At the same time, over time, the American private sector union world has slowly but continually, and one might say even inexorably, declined, to the point where one of its leaders, a mutual friend of Oren's and I's, David Rolfe, has declared it to be a sinking ship whose captains have not prepared their life rafts or lifeboats. And I think, sadly, and much to its detriment and to the detriment of what Benedict would call this country as a vast and pluralist society, the conservative movement and its political parties have not bemoaned the decline of labor, but celebrated and abetted the demise of the labor movement. While during the Reagan era, it was true that certain prudential reforms of labor were necessary, among those in the movement, they became prima facie against organized labor, and instead of actively working to make better labor unions, as you would expect from a movement that celebrates the uniquely American mode of organizing admired by Tocqueville, they simply oppose them wholesale. The right has opposed labor, organized labor, almost wholesale. I haven't found anybody until I met Oren that has been on the right that has supported them. Tocqueville or another visitor from another country where French is an official language would search in vain for an American culture of association and organizing and labor among the right. And I think if he looked at the conservative movement, and especially within the influential religious voices within that movement, he would find the worst offenders. He would find, for instance, the leading think tank from a religious viewpoint, one headed by a Catholic priest no less, that it takes as its basic stance on labor that the best jobs are union-free jobs. That's the Acton Institute. Charles Baird is their voice, and he says the best jobs are union-free jobs. There's been such a focus on the voluntary nature of unions, which I support. It has been so intense and so myopic that it has effectively turned into a reactionary libertarian think tank rather than a Christian think tank that actually promotes unions and promotes a religious view thereof. I would say that Orthodox religion should make you ideologically heterodox. That has not been the case. So, what are the steps? What are some practical steps? Oren is right that this conference has had a lot of talk, not a lot of practical steps. What are some steps to revive the roots according to the principles I laid at the beginning? First, and I'm going to give a shout out to my main man from Notre Dame, Patrick Deneen here. First, start a union or a labor association that lines with the principles I laid out. If you don't like the unions you have, be American and start your own. Data suggests that the workers would be interested. If you put a union out there that was not politically aligned, that was very clear that it was going to focus on that gave workers choice, workers would join it. The conservative movement should start some unions. If you're conservative, start it. If you're American, start it. Tocqueville, make him come and recognize this country. Organize. Pluralism is good. Second, you should strengthen, reform, and partner with unions that already share many of these principles. Sean's going to talk in a minute, and I think his unions exemplify a collaborative worker and capital partnership that actually works in the real world and in the real market. You should support people like Sean and his unions. If you know a contractor, if you know workers, tell them to give Sean's organization a call. Sean's not paying me for that. And I would say next that if you need to recognize that worker power is more often than not family power. If you are someone like myself who considers a stable two-parent family to be the basic building block of a free and prosperous society, then consider the growing body of evidence that shows that employment and income stability are closely linked with family stability. The strength of marriages and the well-being of children, including the health, educational, employment outcomes of these children. Labor unions can start a virtuous cycle that affect families, that affect unions, that affect this country. Start there. Fourth, we should rejig the relationship between the conservative movement, its parties, and the working class. The working class has either been ignored by the American right for too long. And when attention has been paid, as it's been done recently, it was done so in a way that stoked grievances and fueled resentment while providing little to nothing in terms of real structural pro-worker policy. And we've heard some of that here too, haven't we? I would say, friends, resentment doesn't nourish. American workers have legitimate grievances. Don't let the demagogues use that for their own vain gain. File the grievances in your legislatures and make the grievers whole with a practical pro-worker policy agenda. Judging from the history of Christian democratic and movements in Europe like the ones I alluded to, those in my ancestral land of Netherlands, and the recent pro-worker turn of conservative parties in Canada, it's a winning formula. It could turn it into an electoral juggernaut. That's the type of winning you should be focused on, not winning to beat the libs. And last, as a Canadian, I'm just going to get this out there, don't forget that the American labor movement at its best has always made room for an appropriate internationalist posture. I was telling Sean that my first encounter with leaders from NAB2 was at an event where my Canadian union was partnering with American, Dutch, Belgian, and other unions seeking to liberate independent trade unionists in Cuba who were imprisoned by the tyrant Castro for trying to start a workers' organization that actually cared for workers. I would say it's through the support of American unions that the Polish Catholic union Solidarność was able to become independent and later turned into the collapse of one of the worst tyrannies that we've ever witnessed. So I would say that while rootless capital is to be opposed, solidarity among free workers of the world's nations can serve as a reminder that at the end of the day, all work is done by actual workers in actual places with their own distinct stories and communities. We should encourage conversation and interaction with those workers. It's my hope that a renewed focus on worker power within the conservative movement will allow all of those workers to thrive and so strengthen the vast and pluralist society that is the United States. Thank you very much.